Hello Year 12 and welcome to this little revision tutorial on the aims and strategies of the Nazi foreign policy until September 1939. To begin with, you remember that there were two main aims of the foreign policy pursued by the Nazi government after it came to power in 1933. They were the restoration of a Großdeutschland, or Greater Germany, the gaining of Lebensraum, or living space. Those two were underpinned by a third, the dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles. These aims were outlined in two main sources: Hitler's own monograph, Mein Kampf, which was written in 1925 whilst he was in prison after the Munich Putsch, and the Nazi Party's manifesto, known as the 25-point programme, which was originally published by the party back in 1920. So you can see that Hitler and the party were not at all secretive about their aims, even though they were sometimes covert about their strategy. The idea of a Großdeutschland was one big country which would include all Aryan German speakers and only Aryan German speakers. In this way, it would be greater in the sense of including the surrounding area or hinterland, but also greater as in better. The Nazi platform thought of itself as restoring this greater Germany, which had been achieved in an earlier age. Uniting all German speakers would mean bringing into Germany lands belonging to surrounding countries, some of which had previously been part of Germany but were lost at Versailles, and some of which had been separate but were majority German speakers. It would also involve removing all of the existing lower peoples from the area. If you think of Aryans as being Übermensch, or over, first, or best people, anyone else was Untermensch, or less than people. This primarily meant Jews and Slavs, although it included those with disabilities or disfigurements, homosexuals, communists, and so on. Looking at the map here, you can see to the west the orange area, which is the Rhineland that was demilitarized at Versailles, and just to the west of that, southwest of Mainz, you can see the Saarbrücken, or the Saarland, which was a German-speaking area which made independent at Versailles. Then you can see to the south, in a darker orange colour, you can see Austria, which of course is German-speaking but was separate and was originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. North of that, you can see in Czechoslovakia, the orange area around the outside of Czechoslovakia is the Sudetenland, where there are German speakers who are part of the Czechoslovakia that was created after World War I from a bunch of different states. And then in yellow, you can see some other protectorates of Bohemia, Moravia, and some other places, which were Czech-speaking places, but which had large numbers of Germans in them, and which was also made up of very productive agricultural land. Recreating Großdeutschland and encouraging the traditional family roles adopted particularly by German women, that is, motherhood for the nation and so on, would result in a massive expansion of the German population. Those people would need space to grow food and to engage in the idealized agrarian lifestyle promoted by Nazi propaganda. Expansion to the east was a solution to this problem of living space because it was very fertile there. Germany itself is not especially fertile. It's cold for much of the year and the soil isn't too good. In addition to being very fertile, the eastern lands were mostly populated by the aforementioned Untermenschen. And those people could be relatively easily encouraged to leave, forced into labor, or even killed in order to sustain the German peoples. Both recreating Großdeutschland and acquiring Lebensraum would require the destruction of the agreements made at the Treaty of Versailles. How fortunate that those were so hated anyway. Economically, Germany would need to stop the reparations payments, which they would then put instead into a massively expanded military, which they could use to regain, consolidate, or expand territory. This would help regain German honour, as would extending self-determination to all German territories, giving them the right to join the Reich if they chose. Let's now look more carefully at how each of those was achieved. In terms of foreign policy, the economic strategy was centred around stopping the reparations payments. As you know, the Young Plan of 1929 had renegotiated German debts to make them more manageable, but the facade of the golden years could not hold in the face of the Great Depression. That depression really began to bite everyone by 1930. Germany was in the worst shape, arguably, and simply couldn't pay. But Britain and France both had debts to pay too, to the United States mostly. By 1931, President Hoover of the United States had been persuaded to suspend debt payments, allowing in turn the suspension of reparations payments under the Hoover moratorium. The following year, at the Conference of Lausanne, Hitler would refuse to pay any more reparations at all. Interestingly, the debt wasn't ever cancelled. Germany didn't finish paying that until 2010, but the payments were cancelled. Militarily, Germany undertook a process called Aufrüstung, or rearmament, in violation of the treaty provisions. At Versailles, Germany had been limited to 100,000 soldiers, 6 battleships, and no submarines or aeroplanes. They were also forbidden to occupy the Rhineland, which you remember was that little buffer zone between Germany and France. In order to achieve its other aims and to restore its traditional honour, Germany would need to dispense with these limitations. It did so first by subverting the treaty and then by blatantly ignoring it. In the early stages, Germany wasn't ready to risk openly defying Versailles, so they needed to get around it instead. Of the 100,000 soldiers retained in the army, every one was trained for the rank 2 places above himself. So a corporal might learn to do the job of a lieutenant or a captain. In this way, the army could prepare itself for the coming massive injection of private soldiers without being left short of officers to lead them. Meanwhile, those private soldiers joined paramilitary groups like the Freikorps, the SA, and later the SS. They wore uniforms, learned drills, and generally behaved exactly like soldiers. In a similar way, Germany wasn't allowed to have an air force, but they could encourage enthusiasts to train in aircraft clubs on model aeroplanes. Those men would be able to step up when the time came and create a professional air force with very little training required. Between 1930 and 35, factories which were struggling in the Depression diversified into manufacturing new technology like planes. While not technically building a Luftwaffe, this got Germans into work, boosting the economy, and it meant that there were aircraft parts waiting to go and very technical manufacturing skills being developed. After a time, the Nazis were ready to be more upfront about their contravention of the treaty. In 1933, Hitler ordered the expansion of the Wehrmacht, the new name for the army, to 300,000 men, 3 times the size allowed, and the commissioning of 1,000 aeroplanes. He did it quietly, but it could be done because of the training and the parts already out there. By 1935, Hitler publicly announced that Germany would rearm, and by March, the Wehrmacht stood at 550,000 with 2,500 planes. From the outside, it looked as if Germany had multiplied its army by 5 and a bit virtually overnight. Unsurprisingly, the general response among the Allies was nervousness. Britain had to think about its options. It wanted to know how big Germany's navy was. 6 warships is a very specific number, but they knew full well that that wasn't the real number anymore. The most important imperative was to make sure that the German navy was significantly smaller than their own. So Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935, officially sanctioning Germany's contravention of the Treaty of Versailles and agreeing that Germany could have a navy up to 1/3 the size of the British Navy. Finally, Germany occupied the Rhineland in 1936, knocking out the buffer with France, Belgium, the Low Countries, and part of Switzerland, although Switzerland was fairly safe because they have everybody's money as well as the Alps, so they didn't mind so much. It was the beginning of a very slippery slope. But the alternative was telling Germany they couldn't do it or else. And the else meant war. Britain and France in particular desperately did not want war. Hitler, on the other hand, did. There's some historical debate over whether he wanted the war he got when he got it, but there's no doubt that Hitler was preparing Germany for a war of conquest pretty much from the beginning. On its mission for Grossdeutschland, Germany started by employing self-determination. A plebiscite was held in the Saarland in 1935, in which the locals voted to rejoin Germany. Likewise, in Austria in 1938, another plebiscite was held. This time, though, the conduct of the vote was a little more dubious. The Austrian president was invited to Hitler's retreat at Berchtesgaden and harangued for long periods by Hitler himself and other leading Nazis. Furthermore, the voting card that you can see in the top right of the screen was hardly objective, and there were SS standing by to make sure the Austrian public voted correctly. After Austria, even the pretense of self-determination was dropped, with the Sudetenland and then the rest of Czechoslovakia simply taken. Actually, after the Munich Conference of September 1938, at which Chamberlain secured what he called peace for our time by agreeing that Hitler could have the Sudetenland, Hitler was said to have been disappointed that he didn't get to take it by force. Poland, as we know, was a final straw. Hitler invaded, Chamberlain threatened war, and Hitler thumbed his nose. War it was then. Of course, German expansionism didn't happen in a vacuum. One of the most contested historical debates going is about the policy of appeasement followed by the Allies, especially Chamberlain's Britain. But they weren't the only players. Here's a list of the international events and agreements that we haven't yet discussed in detail. In the 1936 Spanish Civil War, Germany supported the fascist nationalists against the Republican government. It was an opportunity to show off and to test out German strategies and weaponry. Remember, the Wehrmacht was newly expanding at this time, and their officers, while well trained, could really use the practical experience. After the Civil War, Spain was ruled by a fascist regime under General Franco and played very little part in the coming conflict. In the same year, Hitler made friends with his fellow fascist dictator Benito Mussolini of Italy in the Rome-Berlin Axis of October 1936, which was later formalized in the Pact of Steel. In between times, with fascist regimes joining forces around him, Chamberlain secured peace in our time at the Munich Conference in September 1938 by giving the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for Hitler's promise not to invade anyone else. Hitler called the agreement a piece of paper and went right on preparing to invade first Czechoslovakia and then Poland. All this friendship between fascist regimes really surprised nobody, given their sympathetic political views and nationalistic agendas. What freaked Britain and France out, though, was the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The Nazis had openly professed to hate communists, and Soviet Russia was the centre of communism. Further, the threat of war on two fronts was one of the few remaining factors keeping Germany in whatever version of check you consider her actions at that point to be. So the bilateral promise not to attack each other for the next 10 years was unexpected, to say the least. It was alarming, to say the most. It wasn't sincere, though. Neither Hitler nor Stalin expected it to last. It was just a play for time. Stalin needed to mobilize his army for the invasion he knew was in the post, and Hitler needed to knock France out without risking retaliation from the east. Many historians agree that this pact tipped the balance for Chamberlain. When Germany invaded Poland less than 2 weeks later, he issued an ultimatum, and we already talked about how that worked out. So there you have it, Nazi foreign policy up until September 1939. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any questions in the comments or let me know in class. Thanks for listening.